Hey guys, Lucas Curcio here at Method Ministries. Today I'm going to be responding to an argument by James White. Now, James White has been using this argument for many years. We'll see in the clip, but he admits that he's been using this for many years. But he used it again at at the G3 conference. He was preaching a sermon. I don't know what it was on, but I saw online a portion of this clip. They highlighted it, and it was the same old argument. And I want to respond to this because it's this argument on top of misrepresenting Arminianism and not even understanding what Arminianism is. And honestly, it makes me further convinced that I don't think Mr. White has ever actually studied Arminianism other than just read it from a Calvinist telling him what Arminian theology is. But that's besides the point. I want to respond to it because it's very hypocritical, and it's hypocritical because Calvinism actually agrees more with open theism than Arminianism does. So let's first play the clip, and then I'll explain how.
He doesn't know what free creatures are going to do. And in fact, if God knew what free creatures were going to do, then they wouldn't truly be free. That remains an argument that they make to this day. And I have taught for many, many years that the only consistent Arminian is an open theist. If you confess that God has absolute, unchangeable, perfect knowledge of all future events in his creation, then you can't possibly believe in the Arminian construal of salvation.
Okay, so here's the first thing you need to know, okay? So let's back up. Okay, so Mr. White is approaching this as a Calvinist. Now, as a Calvinist, Mr. White believes that God knows the future because he ordains the future, okay? So God, to put this as an illustration, so we can understand this, God wrote down ahead of time that Lucas Curcio tomorrow will eat a bagel for breakfast. Okay, so God knows I'm going to eat a bagel for breakfast because God has predetermined this ahead of time. Therefore, God knows what He has written down, and that's why He knows the future. Or at least in this sense, this is what we call the future, but it's all been predetermined. So God knows the future because God has written the future. He says again, Lucas Curcio is going to do this tomorrow, and tomorrow Lucas will eat a bagel. So Mr. White believes that if you take this away, if God didn't write this, if God lived up to my choice to say, well, I'll let Lucas decide, what he wants to eat tomorrow. God wouldn't know if it would be a bowl of cereal to bacon and eggs. God wouldn't know it because God didn't write it. So again, Mr. White only believes God can know the future because he ordains the future. Now, here's the thing that you need to understand, okay? And this is it, and you'll easily be able to understand why this argument feels so badly. The open theist will agree with Mr. White. The open theist will agree with the Calvinist. The open theist says that God can't know the future unless he ordains the future. So they'll easily admit, yeah, if God said Lucas Curcio tomorrow will eat a bagel for breakfast, and that's that. That's that. But if you take this away and God leaves it up to my future contingency, my choice, God is not going to know again if I'm going to eat a bowl of breakfast. A bowl of cereal for breakfast or bacon and eggs. He just won't know because God didn't ordain it. Now insert the Arminian. The Arminian will say, no, Mr. Calvinist, you're wrong. And no, Mr. Open Theist, you're wrong. God can know the future even if he doesn't write it. So if God says, I'll leave it up to Lucas to decide what he wants to eat tomorrow for breakfast, then that's that. God will still know it. So what this means then, that the Arminian will say, once more, you're wrong, you're wrong. And the Calvinists and open theists are hand in hand, that unless God writes the future, he can't know it. And God only knows the future because he ordains it. That means that Mr. White is more consistently and agrees more with the open theist than the Arminian does. And it really is this simple. And I say it really is this simple because, when I point this out to people, in particular, the people being Calvinists, they just don't, get it, and they want to argue with me and go back and forth and make all these complicated, redundancies, and and just say, you don't understand the argument, you believe this, and you believe that. Listen, this is very, very simple. Like this is just basic logic. If again, once more, if the Calvinist is agreeing with the open theist that God can only know the future if he ordains it, and if the Arminian disagrees with both of them, if you put it all on the table, who is agreeing more with the open theist? There's only one person, who's disagreeing with two people here. That's it, and that's the Arminian. So, Mr. White, I'm disagreeing with you, and I'm disagreeing with the open theist. The open theist is disagreeing with me and agreeing with you on this. They're saying, yeah, if God wrote the future, he can know it. If he doesn't, he can't. That's that. So again, who's more consistently an open theist? It's not me, it's you. It's not me, it's you. And this is why this argument just really has to go, because it demonstrates, well, one, it's a misrepresentation of Arminian theology. And as I said, in the opening statement, it makes me believe that when people use arguments like this, they haven't done their due diligence and study. Now, I don't say that to insult. It just reveals to me something that, well, you couldn't possibly make this argument if you knew what you were talking about on this subject. Because here's the thing: Arminian theology is not just non-Calvinist or non-Calvinism. Arminian theology is not just somebody who isn't a Calvinist. It's just not. So Arminian theology is a theology independent from Calvinism. You can't just talk to somebody who's not a Calvinist and who disagrees with you and say, oh, they're an Arminian. Well, that's definitely not true, because why in the world then are there provisionists? Why do you have Wesleyans? There are different facets of this. So you can't just talk to a non-Calvinist and clump everybody in the same category. You have to study each theology independently. If you did that with Arminian theology, you would know that no way, no how can you even quote Arminian theology as being consistently open theism. You just can't do it. Now, there are Arminians who are open theists, but just like, there are Calvinists who don't hold a limited atonement. There's always going to be exceptions to the rules, but these aren't the rules. So when you say that Arminian theology consistently is open theism, well, that's just not true. And have you ever actually studied and sat down and read from a primary source of what Arminian theology is? Because you would know if you did. You would know if you did that this argument doesn't hold any weight whatsoever. It doesn't hold any weight, and it's very hypocritical. Now, another thing I want to point out is that there's a huge logical fallacy according to the Calvinist scheme of what is foreknowledge and how God knows the future. So again, just to state the premise: God knows the future because He ordains the future. That's Calvinism's foreknowledge. And if God doesn't ordain the future, He can't know the future. So what this means then is that omniscience is not an attribute. Omniscience is an action. So when we say God is omniscient, we're saying that God is this. That's an attribute. That's different from saying God does this. So if God is omniscient only because he is doing something, then that's not an attribute. That's an action. This is like saying that God is sovereign, right? Well, that doesn't mean that God has to do the highest expression of His sovereignty to be sovereign. We're just saying that God is this. God is anything. Like, God is love. I'm not saying that God has to love mankind to be love. God is love. So I don't have to say that God has to do something to be something. Again, that's not an attribute. God is omniscient. God is all knowing. So that means even if God doesn't do something to gain something under this scheme, because God has to do something to know, to know something, then that's not an attribute. And this is why this is fundamentally flawed. And that means that Mr. White really doesn't think that God is omniscient. He just thinks that God is doing something. So what he calls an attribute of God is really just an action of God. So if God doesn't do something, then God isn't omniscient, because what is God knowing? There's nothing to know under this scheme. When the biblical model is that God is all-knowing, God is omniscient. He knows all things. He doesn't have to do something to gain something. And this is a fundamental flaw in Calvinism. Now, some people will try to argue and push back and say, well, if God knows something, then that means then that's that, right? Because God can't know anything false. And this is this is just semantics. And Robert E. Pesarilli, if I'm pronouncing that right, pointed this out well. He's a classical Arminian. I recommend that you pick up his works. If you want to get a primary source before you would talk about things like Mr. White does that he doesn't know. But even Robert E. Pesarilli pointed out that God can know the certitude of a contingent event. So certitude is different from contingency. Certitude refers to the fact of an event. Contingency refers to the nature of an event. So there's no logical syllogism out there that can disprove that God can't know future contingencies. There's nothing There's nothing. That's just an assumption. If you want to argue like Mr. White and say that God can't know the future unless he ordains the future, well, that's an assumption. And the burden of proof is on you to prove that. Why are you assuming that God can't know contingencies? Well, because there's sovereignty and this and that. Listen, I don't want more of your presuppositions. I want actual arguments. I need to know why. Show me a logical syllogism. And you can't do it. There is no logical syllogism that says that God can't know the future unless he ordains it. That's just a presupposition. It's a wrong presupposition. And I need to know why you think that God can't know free acts ahead of time. When the Bible tells me over and over again, God knows it. And that's just a reality. The biblical testimony is that God knows future events. And it doesn't say, oh, Calvinism, that's how he knows it. It just says that God knows foreknowledge. And even in other cases, like in Acts 2, talks about how God predetermined and had foreknowledge of the crucifixion of Christ. Well, if foreknowledge is God writing the future, then why is that in the same sentence of predestination? That's a tautology. That's a redundancy. That's like saying that God foreknows the future because he foreknows the future, or God predestined the future because he predestined the future. It just doesn't make any sense. Foreknow means foreknow. It means prior knowledge. It means ahead of time. It means pre-knowledge. Again, God is omniscient. He knows all things. He simply is. And this is why I hold a simple foreknowledge. I don't need to explain the mechanics of it. See, a lot of times, Calvinists get caught up in like the logic of their system. Like, they want to explain everything. I don't need to know how God can do something to know that God can do something. Like, when I read Genesis and see that God spoke, the universe into existence. Well, I don't need to know how God does that. I just need to know that he did do that. So I don't need to know, well, how can God know the future? That's besides the point. Does God say he knows the future? Well, then God knows the future. Case closed. And you're the only one that disagrees with this, that God can't know the future unless he ordains it. Or I should say, you and the open theists. The rest of Christians and the majority, definitely Arminian theology, has no problem affirming, yes, God knows the future. And to say that, oh, if you were consistent, you would be an open theist. Listen, that's just rhetoric. That's not actually dealing with arguments, and you're misrepresenting us. And Calvinists are really good at this. There's a lot of false accusations and false characters and straw man. So people think they know what Arminian theology is because they get their information from people like Mr. White. And this is why when I have real conversations with people, I'm usually not even arguing with what we actually believe in, but what they think we believe in, because they got it not from a primary source, but from Mr. White, and they go to their G3 conference, and they when they meet a true Arminian, they think, oh well, he's just a consistent open theist. And now we're not even engaging with what I actually believe in. I now have to work to show you what I don't believe in, and this is why again I want to make this video, because it's misrepresenting Arminianism, and it doesn't help the conversation. It doesn't help people to have true understanding. Like, even if you disagree, at least know where I stand, for crying out loud. And Mr. White, as he says, has been using this argument for years and years and years. Well, I think it's time that we start putting arguments like this to rest. They're not good arguments. They're not thought out, and they're hypocritical. And Calvinism agrees more with the open theist than the Arminian does. Guys, thanks for watching. If you could please like this video, subscribe, and share. And until next time, we'll see you around. God bless.